Hello, my name is Mike. This is a bike. But that's not the topic of today's episode. This episode is coming to you kind of late, and that's because we ran into some little time delays on our project car here. I had to order a part. You see, this is the bell housing that came with the car, and it's really oily and ugly and greasy, so I got one that's a lot cleaner. Yeah. It also has the correct bell housing pattern to fit our engine block. It took a long time to get here, so that's bad. But it is the correct part, so that's good. But it's got a bolt broken off in it, so that's bad. However, it's exactly what we need to go ahead and put the engine in the car, so that's really good. So we'll probably make some progress today. I did as much little stuff as I could to try and get the car ready so that when we do get this part installed, we can put the engine in. So, stick around.
Somewhere in a dusty, dirty back alley in western Arizona, not far from historic Route 66, is an old fart trying to cram a square peg into a round hole. He'll work on anything, just as long as it's got at least 2 cool wheels.
So while I was waiting, I ran the necessary wires for my new ignition system, and I created an adapter so that we can use the new charging system that came with that engine. So that portion of it's done, but I also decided I want to get some gauges in this car so I can see, well, if I've got oil pressure or if it's overheating. So I purchased the cheapest gauge set you can possibly get on eBay. I think it was like 20 bucks. That's not too bad. You know, it'll do its task. It's got the lighting, it's got the sending units. So I'm going to go ahead and mount this on the dash before I get the engine installed and started. And I got some wiring from all that spare wiring that came with the engine. I snipped out a few wires, and these wires are the correct color code for a 1984 Mustang. Now you might ask, why do I care if the color code is the same for the sending units on a 1984 Mustang and Capri? And that's because, well, eventually I'm going to do away with that and I'm going to get a gauges cluster from a Mustang. So the dash in this car is the same as all the other Fox bodies of that era. The main difference is this wood grain trim panel and the instruments themselves. This one's got idiot lights, but if I get a gauge cluster from a Mustang of that same era, it will fit right into this opening. All the AC vents and openings and panels and stuff are going to be the same. The main difference is instead of these square idiot light, just a speedometer and a fuel gauge, I'll actually have a full complement of gauges. I've just got to find the gauge cluster and the trim panel that aren't at exorbitant prices. And none of the local wrecking yards happen to have any Mustangs in stock at the moment. So we'll put that other set of cheap eBay gauges in, $20 set of gauges, until we can find the correct Mustang gauges for this car. Now I went to install the sending unit that came with that gauge set. It was the wrong thread size, but I happened to find an adapter. I thought I'd be all good and everything. I got the factory sending unit out, only to find that this interferes with the oil filter. So now I've got to go back to the junkyard and try and find one of those extension-y thingies so that this will be moved away from the oil filter. So, you know, every step of the way I've got a setback. Setback here, setback there. Yeah, it's amazing to get anything done at all. Anyway, we'll press forward. We'll get as much done as we can. This looks like a good donor. Yay! Adapter gizmo. Well, I drilled like a madman. I used my reverse drill bits, which usually do the trick. They'll grab that fastener and pull it out, but ended up having to drill the bolt out completely. And really what I ended up doing was drilling half the bolt out. So I still have threads in there on half the hole. Are half threads enough to hold the bolt? Actually, they are. I put a bolt in it. It did snug down, but I don't trust it. So when I go all back together with everything, when I go to put the starter in, it's going to get a longer bolt and a nut on the backside. And fortunately, this is the bottom, so I won't have any trouble getting a nut on the backside of that bolt. So, best we can do under the circumstances. And so that means we're ready to put the bell housing and the torque converter back in. Well, here we go. The moment we've all been waiting for. Well, the moment I've been waiting for. I'm going to pick that motor up and see if we can get it to fit in the car. Fingers crossed. Well, she's in. She's all bolted up into place. I still got some stuff to do underneath, the starter and torque converter nuts and some other stuff. And then, of course, all we have left is everything else. But it's getting there. It looks almost like a car again. But I'm beat, so I'm going to hit it tomorrow morning. We'll get back out here and we'll do the rest. Well, it's the next day, and I still have to tighten up the torque converter nuts. But before I did that, I got to thinking, you know, we emptied that transmission out completely when we did the service on it, and we also drained the torque. Well, I also drained the torque converter when I had it out. So there is no fluid in that transmission. So as we're rotating the engine to get to those bolts, I thought, well, it would make sense to have fluid in it. So that way as we're rotating it, it can start the priming process and start to deliver oil fuel. But then I got to thinking, if I do that, some of that oil is just going to squirt out on the transmission cooler lines. So then I decided, well, I need to put the radiator in first, so that way I don't squirrel oil out when I'm rotating it to prime the transmission. Does any of that make sense to you guys? Anyway, radiator's in, transmission cooler lines are connected up. I've already put a couple of quarts in the transmission. We're going to put it back in the air, we'll put those torque converter nuts in and rotate these around so we can get to them all. And that'll help circulate the fluids a little bit prior to actually starting. So here's where we're at. I've got this panel in place and this bracket for the shift linkage, but it's at kind of a steep angle. Don't believe that's the way it was before. This must be located further back than the original one. I don't know. We'll see if it works. If we've got to modify it, we will. Another thing I noticed is got a little bit of oil leakage from my new pan. And it's actually leaking from this little housing assembly thing on here for a dipstick. Now I use the original dipstick location, so I don't even need this. I put a plug in it, but it's not the plug that's leaking. There's a gasket that goes between the pan itself and this metal housing. So it's leaking. What I'm going to do is when I go to change the oil, I made a whole nother cover. And what I'll do is I'll just, use some RTV on this, and the bolt holes line up with the bolts on that thing, and we'll put a Band-Aid on it made out of metal. And that'll stop it from leaking. So I'm going to wait until I go to do an oil change. That way the oil level is nice and low and we don't have oil interfering with our RTV while it's setting up. The other problem I noticed is, well, if you look at the header, I don't know if you can see it too good from here, but the steering shaft is right up against that header. It's got a little indentation for it to accommodate it, but it's right up against it. And I also noticed that this mount here, there's an alignment peg that didn't quite make it in the hole. It's only out by a tiny bit. So I'm going to have to jockey the mounts around a little bit. I'll get that in, and then I'll see if I can't loosen the mounts up and scooch the engine that way a little bit to get it off that steering shaft. So that's what we're up against under here. And then, of course, I still have to install the starter. And but I think that's about it for the undercarriage. And then I can go back up top and, do things like carburetors and stuff. And speaking of mounts, I did go ahead and replace the rear trans mount because it was pretty cracked up and dry. So that should hold at least the back end of it fairly stable. Okay, a little time has gone by. Well, a lot of time has gone by. And I got my motor mounts in where I wanted them and got them all lined up as best I could. And then I went to put the starter in. And that was a piece of cake. Starter went, no, it didn't. It was a nightmare. There's not enough room between the frame and the bell housing unless you take the motor mount out. And I couldn't get in through here. I ended up having to come in from the top. In other words, take the motor mount out, go in through here with the starter, and then I could get it put in place. It wasn't, I keep forgetting, this isn't the same car that I took apart. It's got a whole different subframe. It's got a whole different engine. So on the 6-cylinder version of it, it was a piece of cake getting the starter in and out. On this one, not so much. So we're all done with everything underneath. I've got my ground attached. I've got my starter cable attached. My cooler lines are strapped down. Pretty much everything underneath that needs to be done is done. So now all we have is everything else from the top. We got some wire harnesses to route power steering hoses out of bolt right in. That should be pretty simple. One thing I didn't like is the fuel line here. It exits real close to that header, so I'm going to have to wrap it with some, heat resistant stuff shield so it doesn't melt the fuel hose. I got to take the radiator back out so I can put the fan shroud in because I'm an idiot. And then we got a couple of heater hoses to connect. I'm not going to worry about the AC hoses just yet. I got to go get the battery back for this because I stole it to put in the Yard Art Cougar because the one in the Yard Art Cougar got a hole in it somehow and was leaking battery acid everywhere. So that means I got to buy another battery. And then I can put the carburetor on it and figure out how to make the wrong linkage work that carburetor. And then I also have to install some kind of a kickdown. You see, this was the kickdown lever assembly that was on the car. This end attaches to the transmission, and this long squiggly tube bar thing went up to the mechanical throttle linkage up on the engine on a bracket on the side of the engine. And so when you stomped on the gas, it would, do one of these numbers. And of course that bracket and that linkage is no longer exists, so I don't need that anymore. Fortunately, some aftermarket company came up with a kickdown cable specifically for a C5 transmission. So this end will connect directly where that link thing did. I just got to figure out how to make this another end here attached to the carburetor throttle linkage. Heck, I haven't even put the carburetor on it yet. This might be another challenge, but we'll knock them down as we hit them. Truth is upon us. We're going to see if we can get it to pop. Obviously, I'm not quite done hooking stuff up. I've got to figure out some kind of a radiator hose that'll do that. So, but at least we can find out, because this engine is an unknown, just see if we can get it to pop and fire a little bit. I'm going to put a little gas in the carburetor since I don't have a fuel system hooked up for it yet. So we'll do this, get a little gas in the float bowl and use a little starting fluid and see if we can't get it to pop. Call that a win. Well, that's going to do it for this episode, guys. I heard it run. That makes me feel real happy because all this work that I went through is not for naught. Or not. Anyway, that'll do it for this episode because, well, I got a lot of weird little stuff to chase down. I've got to find a hose that'll fit. I got to figure out why when I turn the ignition key I'm not getting a signal to my solenoid. That probably has something to do with the shift linkage. I've got to, what else do I have to do? My timing is way off. I'm off a tooth. I got to pop the distributor out, move it a little, set it down, because that's as far as I can advance it, and it needs more advance. And then I'm going to have to get this thing on a trailer and take it in someplace where I can get an exhaust system put in, because, well, don't really want to drive it with the uncorked headers because all that heat's going to like melt stuff underneath the car. And I don't need melted, wires and cables and such. So anyway, come on back for the next episode and hopefully have all that stuff ironed out and we'll figure out if the hood will fit. Yeah, I don't think it will. Both the carburetor and the distributor are sitting up pretty high. We'll find out. You'll just have to tune in to see. Thanks for watching.